Okay, so can you hear me pretty well now? So today we're going to get into the angiosperms in a big way. I just started to introduce you to flowering plants at the end of last lecture. And there are several things to say about flowering plants that may help to explain why they've been so successful worldwide. I haven't gotten into their fossil record much, except to say that they came in pretty late relative to other seed plants in the fossil record. And one of the really cool things that you see looking at that is that the angiosperms almost appear to explode into the fossil record. There's a gradual appearance at first, and then they come to dominate the vascular plant fossil record within just a few million years, apparently displacing a lot of the gymnosperms and ferns, lycophytes. This is all happening during the last part of the Mesozoic, and while there's still dinosaurs around, and a lot of our modern flowering plant families, bulk of the diversity really was in place by the time the asteroid impact occurred that wiped out the dinosaurs. And a lot of that diversity of flowering plants survived the asteroid impact. So it's pretty amazing success of a group to just suddenly appear and then take over. And there are a number of features here that I'm going to talk about today, and we'll probably get into next time as well, that may help to explain their phenomenal success. So I started to mention the flower last time, and this is the innovation that everyone thinks of when we think of flowering plants. And this is a cartoonish one that doesn't really represent any particular flowering plant, but shows the various appendages. And we started to talk about some of these sterile appendages, like the petals, which serve an important advertisement function that serves to attract pollinators, animal pollinators. And it's pretty clear that the ancestral flowering plants were insect pollinated. So it's conceivable that just the fact that we had a shift from wind pollination, possibly, may not have been wind pollination, we don't really know, but the fact that we had insect pollination and this greater efficiency and precision, less wastage of pollen compared to a wind pollination system, that could have been important. Not knowing exactly how flowering plants are related to other seed plants makes it a little difficult to say about that. But there's some features of the flower with regard to the fertile appendages that might be really important to their success. The first one I'll mention, the outermost fertile appendages are the stamens. And these are, again, modified leaves, like all of the appendages of the flower. They don't look much like leaves today, but if you look at, let's go back. I'll get to that in a second. Most of the flowering plants today have stamens that have a sterile stalk like this, a narrow stalk called a filament, and then a fertile part that bears the microsporangia that produce microspores by meiosis, and those then germinate to become male gametophytes, the pollen. And the fertile part is called an anther, A-N-T-H-E-R, that we see in most flowering plants. And if we look at pollen, there's a huge diversity of pollen morphologies across the flowering plants. So these are the male gametophytes produced by the pollen sacs or the microsporangia of the stamens. And you can see this is a wide diversity of different taxa represented here, but the sizes and the shape, the numbers of pores or furrows from which the pollen tubes can germinate, the ornamentation, it's all really different, and it can be really distinctive across major groups of flowering plants, and even can help to separate really closely related species. So there's a whole field called palynology focused on pollen, and angiosperm pollen in particular is really useful for identification of fossil remains. It's often the only thing that fossilizes among flowering plants, which have pretty soft cones. I mean, these flowers are really cones, but they're not very resistant to decay compared to, say, a conifer cone. And a lot of the parts of angiosperms are pretty soft and readily decomposed, but pollen doesn't. The external layers of the pollen are really resistant to decay. we have a good angiosperm fossil record, and you can learn a lot about paleo environments from angiosperm pollen. Okay, so the innermost fertile appendages, the second, are the carpels, or it might be just a single carpel here. And these are basically modified leaves again that bear the ovules, which include the megasporangia, where we end up having the germination of female gametophytes. Now, a carpel doesn't look much like a leaf today, and typical carpel has a sticky receptive surface up here where pollen germinates, an elongate tube here that the pollen tubes grow down through to reach the ovary here, and inside the ovary is where we have the ovules, the immature seeds. Okay, so this is an artist's conception, pretty crude drawing of what we might have in the way of evolutionary steps that went from a leaf, an open leaf bearing ovules, what we call a megasporophyll. The term's not important, but it's basically a leaf that bears ovules. And in evolutionary terms, it appears that we probably had an inrolling of the margins of this leaf, a fusion along the margins to create this conduplicate carpel, this leaf that's fused along its edges to now have its ovules inside of a protective chamber. And this is the holy grail of paleobotany. If you could find a carpel that was older than the Cretaceous, you would be instantly famous and on the cover of Science and all, because no one ever has. And it's really the carpel that's the most distinctive feature of the angiosperm flower. And it may well be a key to the success of angiosperms to provide this extra protection to their ovules, which bear their precious embryos at some point. The female gametophytes live like in the gymnosperms throughout their lives inside the ovules, and ultimately the embryo also is going to be contained within the ovule and inside these seeds, or it would be by the time it becomes a mature seed, the ovule that is. Also here you can see some artist conceptions of the evolution of stamens. A typical stamen, like I just showed you, doesn't look a whole lot like a leaf. But actually there are some stamens of modern angiosperms that look pretty close to this. And these are members of the angiosperms that often branch off fairly deep in the tree of flowering plants. And so there are some transitional stages that we can see. There are some carpels that look a lot like this in modern flowering plants that also are early branches, and even some that don't have complete fusion of the edges. Up at the tip, there's a bit of, they're only fused by secretions rather than true fusion of the tissue. So there are some nice intermediary steps. Now, one thing I want to mention is that sometimes more than one carpel has fused together to form a structure like this that has an ovary, a style, and a stigma. And if you cut the thing open, you can see that it's partitioned oftentimes into multiple chambers that represent different carpels that fuse together. So the carpel is the modified leaf bearing the ovule. More than one carpel can actually make up a structure like this, and it can look really similar if it's one or more. So we use this term pistil oftentimes to just refer to the structure that has an ovary, a style, and a stigma, regardless of how many carpels make it up. Is that clear then? So the pistil is just neutral as far as how many carpels are involved in making one of these structures that has an ovary, a style, and a stigma. Okay, and sometimes you can have multiple stigmas and multiple styles that can help give away the fact that there's more than one carpel involved in the pistil, but typically there's just one ovary in a pistil. I mean, it might be partially lobed, but still, if it's fused together near the base, it would still be called one pistil. Okay, so it's just one unit like that is a pistil. You've probably heard the term pistil and carpel, and that's the distinction there. I'll tend to use those terms a little interchangeably, but that's just for your information. Okay, and so also, in addition to the flower being a fertile shoot, flowers are also born in compound shoots, and these arrays or clusters that can be really distinctive in terms of their architecture. And we're not going to get into the terminology involved in distinguishing these different types of inflorescences, but that's the term that's given to the whole cluster of flowers, an inflorescence, which you'll often see used. And it can be really distinctive for different groups of plants. And it can be pretty important to consider in terms of how pollination and dispersal occurs. Okay, so pollination in angiosperms is really different than in gymnosperms. And this could be really important to the success of angiosperms. And it has to do with the carpel or the pistil again. So one of the things, in addition to protective function, that the carpel forms or serves for the ovules by enclosing them in this protective chamber where they're not exposed to the environment like they are in gymnosperms. Also, the pollen isn't deposited directly on the ovules, unlike in gymnosperms, where the pollen lands directly on the ovule. In the case of angiosperms, the flowering plants, pollen is deposited on that stigma or stigmatic region, like I mentioned, which is far removed from the ovules. And the significance of this is that now we have a situation where the sporophyte parent of the female gametophytes that are living down in these ovules can exercise some parental selection as to which males, which suitors are going to fertilize the eggs of the sporophyte's daughters. So the sporophyte that's the parent of these gametophytes living down in here, these female gametophytes, has the potential to exercise some discrimination against unfit suitors, unfit male gametophytes, these pollen grains. And they may fail to germinate because of interactions between the stigma and the pollen grain. We'll get into that more in a minute. Another thing that can happen is that, that discrimination can happen at the point of preventing the pollen grains from germinating, or it can actually inhibit the growth of the pollen tubes, which have to grow all the way down this style to get to the ovule. So in addition to the sporophyte being able to discriminate between mates, we also basically have the males competing with one another to get to the ovules. They have to grow all the way down here to get to the ovules. And it's essentially a race to get to the ovules. And even if they're not being discriminated against by the sporophyte parent of the female gametophytes, they're competing against one another to get to these ovules in time before they're all fertilized. So there's some male-male competition that's set up here, and there's also selectivity on the part of the sporophyte parent of these female gametophytes. So this could be an important factor that also contributed to success of angiosperms, because there's going to be selection for the most fit males to mate with the females here. Okay, so that's a pretty neat situation that's different than gymnosperms. And again, like in the gymnosperms, the pollen tube has to grow right into the ovule in order to fertilize the egg, because in this case, none of the angiosperms have sperm that actually have flagellae and are capable of swimming. There are a couple of gymnosperm groups that have flagellae on their sperm, and I didn't talk about it. It's not really that important. The cycads and the ginkgo have the largest sperm of any known organism. They each have about 40,000 flagellae on them. They're huge, top-shaped things, but they're also delivered to the ovule. They don't have to swim free in the environment, so it wasn't a big distinction there from the ferns. Or it is a distinction from the ferns, which have to swim through open water, and the lycophytes to get to the female gametophytes. Okay, so as far as discrimination against male gametophytes that are not particularly good mates for the female gametophytes, the sporophytes of most flowering plants have a really interesting genetic system called self-incompatibility. So one thing that you really might want to do is to prevent your own sons from mating with your daughters. Obviously, that wouldn't be a very good thing. Inbreeding taken to the hilt and the potential for rapid loss of genetic diversity, genetic variation after that is repeated for very few generations. And so in any case, self-incompatibility is a system that has evolved, and it actually seems to be ancestral to all flowering plants. The reconstruction based on our phylogeny and the known occurrence of self-incompatibility in flowering plants suggests this was something ancestral that was shared in the most recent common ancestor of flowering plants. And this system can also discriminate against close relatives, like siblings of the sporophyte. So how it actually functions is that there's a locus, a genetic locus, a gene called the S locus, and the sporophyte that produced the flower, here is its genetic composition. These are the alleles 1 and 2 for this particular parent. And here's the gametophyte, the male gametophyte's allele at that locus, 1 or 2 here. You can see 3, 4, and 5. And you can see that if the male gametophyte shares the same allele at that locus as one of the 2 alleles in the parent sporophyte that produced the flower, then there's going to be an antibody-antigen-like reaction against that pollen that's going to prevent those pollen tubes from getting very far. Whereas if the allele that's seen in the male gametophyte is different than the alleles that are present in the sporophyte that produced the flower, the parent of these female gametophytes, then it won't be inhibited and it can grow down to the ovule. And you can see all of these ones that made it have a different allele than either of the parental alleles in the case of that sporophyte that produced the flower. Yeah. Huge, huge typically. These are some of the most diverse loci in terms of allelic variation. So this is a locus on which there's diversifying selection. So there's actually natural selection favoring new alleles all the time. And the more alleles there are, the better the discrimination ability between self and others. The fewer alleles there are, you're going to end up discriminating against male gametophytes that aren't necessarily very closely related to you, but there just aren't that many alleles in the system. So there's really strong selection for a lot of alleles. So these are really, really, there tends to be a lot of diversity at this locus. Good question. Yeah, Brad? Well, it works across all the flowers would have the same allelic composition. And so, yeah, a flower that the pollen, if the pollen's from a different flower of the same plant, it's going to have the same reaction as if it was made by the same flower, right? So there are 2 types of selfing that can occur in flowering plants. There's selfing within a flower, and there's also selfing between flowers of the same plant, and that has the same genetic consequences because the flowers all have the same genetic constitution. But it's an important distinction in pollination biology, so we'll get to in a minute. That's a good question, too. Okay, another type of mechanism to prevent self-fertilization is one that's pretty obvious. You can make flowers that have either stamens or pistils, but not both. So that's going to prevent selfing within a flower. There are some flowering plants that do that, but they have, on the same plant, they'll have pistillate flowers and they'll have staminate flowers. So there's still the possibility of selfing between flowers on the same plant, but it's not as great as if you had both stamens and pistils in the same flower. They'd be much closer, they're not in such close proximity. And like you can see here, oftentimes the pistillate flowers and the staminate flowers are in different inflorescences in plants that are what's called monoecious. So monoecious, condition of monoecy, which ends with a Y, if you spell it that way, is where you have flowers that are either staminate or pistillate, but you have both types on the same plant. We see that quite a bit in flowering plants. Another way that's a better or a more rigorous way to prevent self-fertilization is called diece, or being dioecious. And if you're dioecious, that means you're producing your staminate flowers and your pistillate flowers on different individual plants. And plants that are dioecious sometimes have chromosomal sex determination. And it can vary a lot, though. There's sex determination in flowering plants that have this kind of systems really can be variable and complex. We won't get into it. But this is obviously a way to prevent self-fertilization altogether. Although occasionally a dioecious plant will produce a flower of the other expression. And that's infrequent, but it does happen in some cases. Yeah? No, they can't. I mean, the ones that are self-incompatible that I mentioned, those have a rigorous genetic system. A lot of plants, though, are self-compatible. And so the reason I make this, I should have mentioned this, but in the case of this this type of mechanism would only be important for preventing pollen wastage if they were self-incompatible in terms of it landing on the wrong stigma. But in a lot of plants, we have a lot of angiosperms have self-compatibility where they've lost the ability or to discriminate against self-pollen. They've lost their incompatibility system. And you might wonder, why would a plant lose its ability to discriminate against self-pollen? Wouldn't that be a real setback to it evolutionarily? And the answer to that is no, because in the end, especially if you have only one reproductive opportunity, if you're an annual plant that lives lives for a single season and flowers and then dies, much better to self than to not reproduce at all. And if no outcross pollen arrives, for example, if you're a colonizing taxon that colonizes open new environments, a weed, for example, selection could strongly favor the ability to self. And there are mechanisms that can favor outcrossing but have pollination assurance in the case that outcrossing doesn't occur. So it's a bed hedging strategy in a way if you're a selfer, that you can at least reproduce if there is no outcross pollen that arrives. So it's evolved multiple times, this ability to self, this loss of self-incompatibility. Okay, so if you can self-pollinate and you can self-fertilize, as pollen from your own plant can fertilize ovules of the same plant, another way that you can prevent self-fertilization, even if you have stamens and pistils in the same flower, is to have a spatial separation between the stamens, or especially the anthers, and the stigma. And here you can see the anthers are up at this part of the tube of this flower that's been cut down the middle. And here you can barely see it from where you're sitting, no doubt, but there's the stigma of a style here and the ovaries down here. Whereas over in this flower, here you can see the stigma, maybe a little better, the spherical stigma. And here are the anthers down here. So that kind of spatial separation can prevent them from selfing. In this particular system, which is a really cool system, these are two different morphs of the same species. This is one individual plant has this morph, another plant has this morph, and only plants of differing morphs, in this case, what we call heterostyle, are the individuals actually compatible. So there is an incompatibility system that operates here, and only these morphs that have the stamens at the same level as the stigma are compatible. And a plant like this can't cross with another plant with a flower like this. And the whole rationale here in terms of efficiency is that a pollinator coming in here is going to get pollen deposited on it at the same position that it's probably going to end up depositing pollen on the stigma here. So depending on how it actually visits the flower, it's probably going to have pollen on its body in a position that's going to be where it contacts the other flower that it visits. So in this case, a pollinator could deposit pollen, say, on its backside here, and the backside of it would contact that stigma. Maybe its head ends up contacting the anthers here, and it ends up contacting the stigma there. So, I mean, this heterostyle system is not one that I'm expecting you guys to know. I'm just pointing out that there's some variation in systems of pollination that take advantage of the spatial separation that can improve the efficiency of outcrossing and tend to prevent selfing. And we see this kind of spatial separation a lot. Now, in some plants, near the end of the flower's life, the style might elongate and the stigmas would come into contact with the anthers, or vice versa, and that would allow for selfing in case outcrossing hadn't occurred. So that's one of those bed hedging strategies that I mentioned, where you might see an advantage to selfing if you didn't get outcrossed, and the flower would actually ensure that it was selfed in that case. Okay, that's spatial separation of pollen and stigma. You can also have separation in timing of pollen release and timing of stigma receptivity. And this is a great example here in a magnolia where you have the various individual carpels here. These are free carpels. The stigmatic regions are receptive here during the first day that the flowers open. But you can see here the stamens are all pressed below the carpels, and they haven't opened yet. In the second day, the stamens start to open up and release pollen. And so pollen, there's a 24-hour period here where only outcrossing pollen is going to be reaching these stigmas, outcross pollen from other flowers at least, hopefully from other plants. And only after that do we start getting pollen released. And it can be the other way around. This is called protogeny, just in case you're interested. Protandry would be where we have the stamens maturing first and then later the stigmas. So it can go both ways depending on taxonomic group. And sometimes you have spatial separation and timing of receptivity or release of pollen operating together in the same species. So these mechanisms that help prevent selfing might also be a real advantage for angiosperms. Conifers can self occasionally. I mean, I mentioned most conifers, not all, but most, and a lot of gymnosperms in general, actually mostly conifers, not cycads and ginkgo, can produce pollen and seed on the same plant, pollen and ovules on the same plant. So they can potentially self-pollinate, but the consequences of self-pollination in conifers are usually lethal for if there is an embryo formed, it usually is unfit relative to outcrossed embryos. But conifers don't have such elaborate mechanisms to prevent selfing as the angiosperms in general. Okay, and then as I mentioned, the whole pollination in general in angiosperms is in general more efficient than what we see in gymnosperms. In angiosperms, about 80% of angiosperms are pollinated by animals. And animal pollination can be a lot more precise and lead to a lot less pollen wastage than wind pollination that we see in the majority of gymnosperms, except for the cycads. Okay, and so you remember from earlier in the course the concept of coevolution. This is basically where we have two interacting organisms that evolve in response to one another. So where these organisms that have an important interaction are actually evolving in response to one another's phenotypes, or in response to the other organism. And this isn't always happening at the level of a species-species interaction between an individual pollinator species and an individual plant species. But in general, if we look at animal pollination and angiosperms in general, there's a strong signal of coevolution that's happened overall during the evolution of both the insects and other animals that pollinate plants, that pollinate flowering plants, and the flowering plants themselves. Here's a great case, though, where we have a one-for-one sort of coevolutionary scenario where an individual plant and an individual pollinator have evolved in response to one another. This is the famous star orchid of Madagascar, which Darwin was made aware of back in the 1800s. This orchid, you may not be able to see it very well, but it has a big nectar spur that runs down here. This is about a foot long. And it's a very narrow little nectar spur. And the nectar accumulates only down here in the last inch or 2 inches of that spur. So when Darwin saw this specimen, he said there must be a moth. It would have to be a moth, given how narrow the spur is, that would have a proboscis that narrow. There must be a moth that has a proboscis that's that long that could reach the nectar there, that had co-evolved with this flower. But nobody knew about such a moth. And only in recent years has the moth been discovered, and it's been called Darwin's hawk moth. And here you can see its proboscis. And it has to unroll this thing out before it actually sticks it into the flower. It's an amazingly awkward-looking procedure, but it actually pulls it off. I think there might be a YouTube you can check out on that. But it's a pretty extreme example, and there are other related hawk moths and orchids that have shorter proboscises and shorter nectar tubes. So we can see there's some evolutionary response going on in both parties here. Okay, so animal pollination is often called biotic pollination. It involves a living pollinator. And as I mentioned, it seems to be the ancestral state in flowering plants. And I mentioned in showing you the flower's sterile appendages that biotic pollination requires an attractant or an advertisement. And, for example, showy parts. And we talked about the petals being often showy, being visually showy, that would attract pollinators like a flag. But sometimes even leaves that are below the flower can serve that function alternatively or in addition, for example, like in a bougainvillea. And stamens sometimes can be showy as well. The filaments sometimes can be brightly colored, like in a eucalyptus. So different parts of the flower, or even parts of the inflorescence that aren't flowers, can serve to help attract the pollinator by visual cues. But there are also olfactory cues that some plants use in the way of odors, and these odors can vary a lot depending on the particular plant group. They can be sweet odors, or they can be incredibly foul and fetid odors. And this is the Titan arum that flowers up at the UC Botanical Garden occasionally. And if you get an email about that or see a report on the Berkeley webpage, it's sometimes posted on the Berkeley webpage. Make a trip up there. This has the world's largest inflorescence. It can be up to about 10 feet tall, and it stinks like a cadaver. It's often called a carrion flower, even though it's not a flower. It looks like a flower, but there are a lot of flowers on this stalk here, and it attracts flies. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So another thing that plants that are attracting animals to pollinate them often provide, in addition to an advertisement, as a reward. So if they've actually produced a reward, then we have a mutualism here, where the animal's getting some sort of fitness benefit by visiting. The reward is often food. Typically it's food. Sometimes, though, it could be a nest-building material. I study a group of tropical vines that produce nest-building materials that female bees visit only to build their nest. It has an antiseptic property, too, that keeps their larvae from being infected by fungi and other microbes. There are some rewards that male bees, for example, collect that are precursors of sex pheromones that allow the male bees to actually be more successful at attracting females. So there are all kinds of crazy things that plants have evolved that help the fitness of their pollinators. But as I mentioned, usually it's food, and pollen is probably the ancestral reward, because that's something that flowering plants were already producing. And actually, when we look at try to reconstruct the ancestral characters using character reconstruction methods based on phylogenies, pollen does look like the ancestral reward. Problem with pollen as a reward, especially as a main reward, is that it's expensive for the plant to produce. The sporophyte, these are its male progeny, and these male gametophytes, these pollen grains, they include a lot of protein and fats, lipids. These are expensive things for the plant to produce, never mind that it would prefer to have these pollen grains. I mean, it'd be selectively advantageous for it to have these pollen grains be successful at fertilizing eggs of female gametophytes. So I should mention that pollen in biotically pollinated plants that are animal pollinated typically is oily or sticky, and it clumps together, and it easily adheres to an animal in clumps. And so that's something that we typically see, and it often has this extensive ornamentation on it that may help it hold this oil and adhere better to animals and to stigmas. So a lot of flowering plants have nectar as a reward. And you might think, well, nectar, that's tasty. You know, pollen, that's not so great. That seems like a step backwards for the plant because nectar must be expensive. It's actually cheap. Nectar is just sugar water. It's very cheap by comparison with pollen. So the animal may like it, and it may be nourishing. It provides calories, but they're relatively empty calories compared to something like pollen. I mean, there can be some vitamins and such in nectar, but it's not nearly as expensive for the plant to produce. And it produces nectar through nectaries. So these are little nectar-producing bodies that can occur on different parts of the flower. And there is some taxonomic distinctiveness. Where the nectaries are located can be helpful for identifying particular plant groups. It's often conserved. And of course, if you're biotically pollinated, you better synchronize your flowering time with your pollinator's activity. So that's just something to keep in mind, and we'll see that in some of the next slides. Okay, so the most important animal pollinators are bees. About 65% of angiosperms, well over half of angiosperms species, are pollinated by bees. And bees are intelligent pollinators. They're insects, you realize, but as insects go, bees are pretty good at learning, and they have really good spatial and pattern recognition. So they can be very good pollinators. They learn how to operate flowers that are pretty complex. And they have a visual spectrum that's pretty broad. I mentioned last time, but it's shifted towards the shorter wavelengths compared to ours. And so they can't see red. Red looks black to them. Red has really long wavelengths. It's at one end of the spectrum. At the short end of the spectrum, blues, for example, violet, they see those well. So we often flowers often that are bee pollinated will have flowers that are bluish or purplish or yellowish, but not reddish. And sometimes they have interesting patterning that can be seen in UV light, like I mentioned at the end of the last lecture. So to really see what the bee sees, you need to also consider the UV part of the spectrum. And often the flowers will have these kinds of patterns, like a bullseye or guidelines, that'll help the bee to orient toward the fertile appendages, and that's something that bees are really good at. And the scent of the flower can be really pretty diverse, but there often is a scent involved in bee-pollinated flowers, a pretty distinctive scent that even our poor noses can pick up on. And of course, there's a lot of concern about extinction of bees and loss of bees as pollinators, because they're some of our most important pollinators of crop plants as well, in addition to wild plants. So here is, these are representatives of the bee orchids. And bee orchids are kind of go to show you that that bees are not quite as intelligent as you might hope. The orchids have taken advantage of this, and here you can see a male bee pseudocopulating with an orchid flower, thinking that it's a female bee. And you can see it has the pollinium of the pollen, or the pollinium of the flower, which contains all the pollen, was attached to its head there before it left. So we can look at that again if you'd like. So these flowers may not look very bee-like to you and me, but to the bees that visit them, the male bees, they look enough like a female bee to be attractive. But what's most interesting is it turns out, it's only been recently found that these flowers are actually producing female sex pheromones, or producing sex pheromones similar to that of the female bee. And there are also orchids like this that are associated with wasps, other Hymenoptera, that have specific pheromones. I'll see he just got the pollen, the pollinia on his head there. So he'll now go to another flower, attempt to copulate with that as well. So he won't get any reward. There's no fitness advantage in this. You know, he gets a cheap thrill maybe, but he's not actually getting anything that's going to benefit him in the long run. But the plant got something great out of the deal because it didn't have to provide a reward, and it got pollinated. And that one pollinium that it took with it will pollinate all the ovules of the next flower, with large numbers of pollen grains inside of each one of those. So this is what we call deceit pollination. And so the plants are sometimes cheaters. It's not a mutualism in some cases. The plants sometimes cheat their pollinator and get pollinated by trickery, essentially. So that's something that the orchids are famous for. Thousands of species of orchids provide no reward to their pollinators. And they've been really successful with that, even with pretty smart pollinators like bees. Okay, moths are another great group of pollinators. It's not nearly as common to have moth pollination syndrome, but it is found in quite a few taxa. And moths are nectar feeders. Here you can see that Darwin's hawk moth with its long proboscis going down into that long tube. And they hover while they feed. They don't land. So there's no landing platform on these flowers, unlike in the bee-pollinated flowers that always have a landing platform. Bees have to land before they can feed. But moths don't, and they also fly, you know, at dusk or after dark. And so the flowers tend to be whitish or pale colored, and they show up in the dark pretty well. And they often have really strong, really wonderfully sweet smells that are really penetrating and carry long distances, often jasmine-y type of smells. And they, you wouldn't notice those odors until it's time for them to flower in the evening when they open and start releasing these fragrances. So they have really nice features here that will allow the moth to actually hone in on them before they actually see them. And these also have oftentimes nectar spurs, as I mentioned, that can be pretty delicate and narrow. Okay, butterflies are also important pollinators. They're closely related to moths, of course, but their activity time is different. They're flowering generally, or they're flying generally during the daytime. And the flowers, like moths, they have good visual senses, and the flowers tend to be brightly colored. And unlike moth flowers, these tend to have landing platforms. Butterflies land when they feed. And they tend to be flat-topped. So either the flower is flat-topped or a whole inflorescence can be flat-topped. And these are nectar feeders like moths. You're having nectar production in the flower, oftentimes with little nectar spurs that are narrow and delicate like in moth flowers. And there's also often a scent associated. Like moths, they have good butterflies have good olfactory senses, and it's often a sweetish smell. They don't tend to go in for the elaborate patterning that the flowers don't, that you get in bee flowers. By comparison with bees, butterflies are idiots. I mean, they are really not very smart insects. And they're beautiful, and we all enjoy them, and they're important pollinators. But as far as learning goes, they're hopeless pretty much because they can only retain one learned thought. And if they learn something new, that old thought gets displaced. And if they get scared, if somebody spooks them, then they forget everything. So they're not particularly easily trained. Now, birds are important pollinators as well. And in the New World here in the Americas, our main pollinating birds are hummingbirds, which don't occur anywhere else in the world. And as you know, hummingbirds hover when they feed. Occasionally they'll land if you have a little landing platform for them, but they're perfectly happy to fly while they feed. And the flowers that are hummingbird pollinated don't have a landing platform, and so they're hard for bees to utilize. But also, birds have a visual spectrum that goes into the red end. And a lot of times, most cases, the flowers pollinated by birds are reddish. That may be advantageous to the plant because insects can't, or bees can't see red. And so they'll not see these flowers. And it's better that they don't because a lot of bees, if they actually spot these flowers, another thing about birds is they need a lot of food. And so these flowers produce a lot of nectar. And so the bee can't really operate it because it can't land here effectively, and it can't get to the nectar a lot of times, which is down the tube. So it'll land on the side and drill a hole in the side and suck out the nectar and destroy the flower. And so there may be selection against having these flowers be visualized by bees. And birds see red colors very well, but they have no olfactory sense, essentially. Birds have really poor ability to smell. And so flowers that are pollinated, that have a bird pollination syndrome, typically have no scent that we can detect. So they produce a lot of nectar. They can be colorful, often reddish. In the New World here in the Americas, they tend not to have landing platforms. In the Old World, there are some birds that, like the sunbirds, that perch when they feed on flowers, and there you get landing platforms. Not on the flower itself, but on the inflorescence. And here's an example of just how much hummingbirds can be attracted to red. And you've probably, if you've hung out red things on a clothesline, you might have seen this, but this guy's not going to benefit too much from this behavior. And then bat pollination is something that might seem pretty exotic to you, but in the tropics, it's really important, and fruit crops like bananas and guavas, bat pollination is important for those, and in the tropics. And again, like moths, bats are typically flying at dusk or after dark, and the flowers have white or palish color. And also, like moth flowers, they're really strongly scented typically, so the bat can follow an odor trail before it actually sees the flower. And the scents can be really strongly fruity, or it can be musky. And the bats will hone in on it. You can see the flowers are huge by comparison with moth flowers. Not always, but they can be big. And they produce a lot more nectar and also a lot of pollen by comparison with a moth flower. Bats both feed on the pollen and the nectar typically. So bat pollination is really cool, and it's not something we see too often, but if you go down to Arizona and you're patient, you could potentially see one of the saguaro cacti down there being pollinated by bats, like you see here. Okay, now fly pollination I mentioned briefly with regard to the Titanarum, that big carrion flower, so-called. And fly pollination is another form of deceit pollination, where the plant is not in a mutualistic relationship with the pollinator, but it's actually exploiting the pollinator to do its bidding, and the pollinator gets no benefit. So in case of fly pollination, the flower color, or the inflorescence color in this case, is often reddish with light spotting, like you see here. And presumably the fly visualizes this as decaying meat, or a decaying cadaver with the white spots being maggots, larvae. And the importance of that is that the reason the fly wants to land here and get to this decaying meat is because it wants to lay its eggs there and have its larvae feed on this corpse. But, and it's often fleshy textured. These plants often have a fleshy texture to their flowers. And the scent of them is horrible, rotten, cadaverous, not pleasant for us. We're pretty lucky that this isn't a dominant type of pollination, or the world would be a pretty stinky and intolerable place for us. Okay, so I've run out of time, but next time we'll talk a little bit more about fly pollination and then get into some other aspects of angiosperm biology. So have a good weekend.